Oil stains covered Ben Carter's hands as he crawled under the broken mining crawler for the third time that week. The machine groaned and sparked whenever someone tried to start it, and the miners were getting angry. They needed their equipment working, or they wouldn't meet their quotas. Ben wiped sweat from his forehead and left another dark smudge there. "Just hold together a little longer," he muttered to the crawler's belly. The metal was old and tired like everything else on Series 7. This asteroid mining station sat far from any major trade routes. Nobody came here unless they had to. Most of the equipment was second-hand or worse. Ben had learned to fix things that should have been scrapped years ago. The workshop around him was small and cluttered. Tools hung from every wall and spare parts filled boxes that reached the ceiling. A half-eaten sandwich sat on his workbench next to a cup of cold synthetic coffee. Ben lived alone above the shop in 2 tiny rooms. He had no family and few friends. Most people on the station were just passing through, looking to make enough money to leave for somewhere better. Ben found the problem with the crawler's power coupling and started the repair. The work was familiar and calming. He had been fixing machines since he was 12 years old. His father had been a mechanic too before the accident that killed him and Ben's mother. That was 15 years ago on a different station. Ben had drifted from place to place since then, always finding work but never staying long. When he finished the repair, darkness had fallen outside. The station's artificial day cycle was ending. Ben gathered his tools and locked up the workshop. He needed to dump some old parts in the waste disposal area before it closed for the night. The bag of broken components was heavy, filled with pieces too damaged to repair or sell. The disposal area sat in the station's lower levels where few people went. The corridors here were dimly lit and the air recycling systems worked poorly. Ben's footsteps echoed off the metal walls as he walked. Most of the other shops and offices had closed hours ago. He was probably the only person awake in this section. He reached the disposal chute and started feeding broken parts into it. The machinery hummed as it sorted materials for recycling. Ben was almost finished when he heard something that made him stop. It sounded like crying, very quiet and coming from somewhere nearby. Ben looked around the empty corridor. The sound came again, definitely not human. It was high and weak, like a small animal in pain. He followed the noise to a maintenance alcove filled with discarded equipment. Behind a pile of old computer terminals, something moved. 2 small shapes huddled together in the shadows. At first, Ben thought they might be cats, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw they were something else entirely. They had scales instead of fur and small wings folded against their backs, baby dragons no bigger than his hand. Their scales were dull gray-green and they looked terribly thin. Ben had heard of dragons before. They ruled a vast empire somewhere in the galaxy, but he had never seen one in person. These babies looked nothing like the proud warriors from the news reports. They were tiny and helpless and clearly starving. One of the little dragons lifted its head and looked at Ben with large golden eyes. It made a soft sound that seemed like a question. The other dragon was too weak to move much, but its breathing was steady. They had been abandoned here to die. Ben knew he should walk away. Aliens weren't allowed on the station without proper permits, especially not dragons. The Galactic Council had strict rules about refugee movement. If security found these babies, they would be shipped back to wherever they came from. If they found Ben helping them, he could lose his business license or worse. But looking at the 2 small creatures, Ben could only think of how hungry and scared they seemed. He remembered being 12 years old and alone after his parents died. Someone had helped him then, giving him food and a place to sleep when he had nothing. Ben pulled his sandwich from his pocket. It was just processed meat and synthetic bread, but it was all he had. He tore off small pieces and held them out to the dragons. The stronger one sniffed cautiously, then grabbed the food with tiny claws and ate quickly. The other dragon could barely lift its head, so Ben held water from his bottle to its mouth. "Easy there," Ben said quietly. "Small bites. You'll make yourself sick." The dragons ate everything he offered and looked at him hopefully for more. Ben had nothing else with him, but he could get more food from his apartment upstairs. First, he needed to move them somewhere safer than this maintenance alcove. Ben looked around and found an old storage crate that someone had thrown away. It was big enough for both dragons and had air holes. He lined it with his work jacket to make it softer. The dragons didn't resist when he gently picked them up. They were warm and their scales felt smooth under his fingers. "Come on," Ben told them. "Let's get you somewhere better." He carried the crate back to his workshop, checking to make sure no one saw him. The station's security cameras didn't cover the lower levels very well, which was lucky. Ben had never broken any major laws before, but he couldn't leave two starving babies to die in the garbage. In his workshop, Ben found a better hiding place behind some large equipment where the dragons wouldn't be seen. He brought food from his apartment and watched them eat. They seemed stronger already and made grateful sounds when he petted their small heads. Ben noticed faint markings on their scales that looked almost like tattoos. The patterns were too regular to be natural, but he didn't know what they meant. Probably just decoration from wherever they came from. What mattered was getting them healthy. As the station's night cycle deepened, Ben made plans. He would need to modify his workshop to hide the dragons properly. He would need to find better food for them and learn what they needed to stay healthy. Most importantly, he would need to keep them secret from everyone else on the station. Ben looked at the two small dragons as they curled up together to sleep. He had no idea what he was getting himself into, but he knew he couldn't abandon them. Sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. 6 months had changed everything in Ben's workshop. Where once only the sound of machinery and Ben's occasional muttering filled the space, now came new sounds. The soft scratch of claws on metal, the gentle whoosh of small wings, and sometimes a happy chirping that reminded Ben of birds singing. The two dragons had grown fast. They were now the size of large cats, their scales bright and healthy. Ben had named them Ember and Spark after watching them breathe their first tiny flames. Ember was slightly larger with golden markings that caught the light. Spark was quicker and more curious, with silver patterns along his wings. Ben had spent weeks modifying his workshop to accommodate his unusual companions. He built hidden passages between the walls where the dragons could move around without being seen. He installed better air filters to hide any smell and sound dampeners to muffle their movements. A secret chamber behind his tool storage became their sleeping area, complete with soft padding and a small heating unit. The most challenging part had been food. Dragons, Ben learned through careful observation, needed more than the processed meals humans ate. They craved fresh meat and certain metals that helped their scales grow strong. Ben had to be creative, trading repair work for real food and quietly purchasing mineral supplements that he claimed were for equipment maintenance. Both dragons had proven remarkably intelligent. Within weeks of their rescue, they began to understand Ben's words and respond to simple commands. They learned the importance of staying hidden when customers visited the workshop. At the first sign of strangers, they would disappear into their secret passages without making a sound. More surprisingly, they began to help with Ben's work. Ember discovered she could sense vibrations through metal, detecting problems in engines that human tools might miss. She would rest her claws on machinery and hum softly, then lead Ben to exactly where repairs were needed. Her accuracy was better than any diagnostic equipment Ben had ever used. Spark developed different talents. His small size and precise movements made him perfect for reaching tight spaces in electronic systems. He could squeeze into control panels and carefully manipulate wires with his claws, following Ben's instructions exactly. His natural electrical sense seemed to help him understand circuits in ways that amazed Ben. The workshop's productivity had actually improved. Repairs that once took Ben days now finished in hours with the dragon's help. He completed jobs faster and with better quality than ever before. Customers started recommending his services to others, bringing more business than he had ever handled alone. But the dragons were more than just helpful workers. They had become Ben's family in ways he never expected. Ember liked to curl up next to him while he worked late into the night, her warm presence chasing away the loneliness that had followed him for years. Spark would bring Ben tools before he asked for them, somehow understanding what he needed next. They played together during the quiet hours when no customers came. Ben would toss small metal balls for them to catch in flight. They would hide around the workshop and pounce on him when he pretended not to notice them. Their laughter, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, filled the space with joy Ben had never known. The dragons were learning to speak, though their voices were still high and childlike. They had started with simple words like Ben and hungry and careful. Now they could hold basic conversations, asking questions about the work and expressing their thoughts about the people who visited the workshop. Ben fix good, Ember would say after watching him complete a difficult repair. Ember help more tomorrow. Spark was more talkative, constantly asking questions about how things worked. Why does the metal get hot when electricity goes through it? Why do the miners need so many machines? Why do humans build everything in straight lines instead of curves like dragon homes? Ben tried to answer their questions as best he could, but many of their inquiries made him realize how little he knew about dragon culture. They sometimes mentioned things from their past that didn't make sense to him. References to the great flights and crystal singing and the old ways of the fire speakers. When Ben asked about their past directly, both dragons became quiet and sad. They remembered little from before their time in the disposal area. They spoke of bright places and many other dragons, but the memories seemed fuzzy and painful. Ben learned not to push for details, accepting that they would share more when they felt ready. The station's news feeds occasionally mentioned distant conflicts in something called the Draconic Empire. Ben paid little attention to galactic politics, focusing instead on local concerns and his growing business. The Empire sounded impossibly far away and had nothing to do with his life on Series 7. As the months passed, Ben noticed the dragons' natural markings becoming more defined. The patterns on their scales grew clearer and more intricate. What he had once thought were simple decorations now looked almost like writing or symbols. The designs were beautiful but completely unfamiliar to Ben. Other changes came too. The dragons were developing new abilities beyond their help with repairs. Ember could now produce flames hot enough to cut through metal when Ben needed precise welding work. Spark had learned to generate small electrical pulses that could restart dead circuits or safely discharge dangerous power buildups. They were also becoming protective of Ben and the workshop. When aggressive customers tried to bully Ben into faster service or cheaper prices, both dragons would position themselves in the hidden passages nearby. Ben could sense their presence even when he couldn't see them, and somehow their support gave him confidence to stand up for himself in ways he never had before. Late one evening, as Ben cleaned tools while the dragons practiced their flying in the larger open area of the workshop, he realized how much his life had changed. 6 months ago, he had been alone, barely making enough money to survive, fixing broken machines for people who barely acknowledged his existence. Now he had a thriving business, a comfortable life, and most importantly, a family that loved him as much as he loved them. Ember and Spark had brought purpose and joy to his existence in ways he was still discovering. Ben happy? Spark asked, landing on the workbench and tilting his head curiously. Ben reached out to gently stroke the young dragon's scales. Yes, he said simply. Ben very happy. Ember joined them, curling around Ben's arm like a scaly cat. We stay together always, she said firmly. Family stays together. Ben nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. He had no idea what challenges lay ahead or how long they could keep their secret, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. These 2 dragons were his family now, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. 3 years had transformed the small workshop into something that looked more like a dragon's lair, mixed with a human repair facility. Ember and Spark had grown to the size of small horses, their wings now capable of short flights around the larger spaces Ben had carved out for them. The simple modifications he had made when they were small had evolved into an elaborate hidden complex behind and above his official workshop. Ben had become an expert at living a double life. During business hours, he was still the quiet mechanic who fixed mining equipment and kept to himself. But when the last customer left and the workshop's security screens activated, his hidden family emerged to fill the space with their presence. The dragon's intelligence had grown along with their bodies. They now spoke fluent Standard Galactic along with some human languages they had picked up from Ben's entertainment files. Their conversations ranged from technical discussions about repair techniques to philosophical questions about the nature of existence that sometimes kept Ben awake late into the night. More importantly, their natural abilities had developed far beyond what Ben had ever imagined possible. Ember could now melt through the thickest armor plating with precisely controlled flame that somehow never damaged anything she didn't intend to burn. Spark could interface directly with computer systems, his natural electrical abilities allowing him to access and modify software in ways that should have been impossible without proper neural links. Together, they had revolutionized Ben's approach to repairs. Machines that would have taken weeks to fix now required only days. Complex problems that other mechanics couldn't solve became routine for their unusual team. Ben's reputation had spread throughout the asteroid belt, bringing customers from mining stations and cargo haulers that were days of travel away. The success had allowed Ben to upgrade his equipment and expand his workshop. But it had also brought unwanted attention. Station security had started asking questions about his sudden prosperity and the unusual energy readings their sensors occasionally detected from his building. Ben had learned to be even more careful about concealing his companions. It was during one of their quiet evening conversations that everything changed. Ben was working on a particularly challenging power core, while the dragons provided their usual assistance. The galactic news feed played in the background, mostly ignored as usual. Civil war in the Draconic Empire continues to devastate outer territories, the reporter's voice droned. Rebel forces loyal to the murdered royal family have been driven back to the frontier worlds. While Empress Vex consolidates her control over the central systems, Ben noticed both dragons had gone completely still. Ember's claws were digging small gouges in the metal workbench. Spark's eyes had gone wide and his wings were trembling. "Turn it up," Ember said in a voice Ben had never heard her use before. It was cold and commanding, nothing like her usual warm tones. Ben increased the volume and watched in growing confusion as his normally cheerful companions listened with obvious distress to news about a conflict happening thousands of light years away. The usurper's forces claim to have eliminated all remaining members of the royal bloodline, but scattered reports suggest that some may have escaped the initial purge 3 years ago. The new Empress has placed substantial bounties on any information regarding surviving royalty. Spark made a sound that was part growl and part sob. Ember's flames were leaking from between her clenched teeth, turning the air around her head into visible heat waves. "Turn it off," she said. Ben shut off the news feed and turned to face both dragons. They were no longer looking at him with the open affection he had grown accustomed to. Instead, they seemed to be studying him carefully, as if seeing him for the first time. "We need to tell you something," Spark said slowly. "Something we should have told you years ago, but we were afraid." Ben set down his tools and gave them his full attention. "You can tell me anything. You know that." Ember moved closer, her large form filling much of the workshop's central space. The intricate markings on her scales seemed to glow slightly in the dim light, more beautiful and complex than Ben had ever noticed before. "My name is not Ember," she said formally. "I am Princess Aurelia of the Royal House of Flame, first daughter of Emperor Maximus and Empress Helena, rightful heir to the Draconic throne." Spark joined her, his silver markings catching the light in similar ways. "And I am Prince Cassius, second son of the same royal house, brother to the heir and protector of the bloodline." Ben stared at them for a long moment, trying to process what they had just told him. "You're royalty?" "We were royalty," Aurelia corrected. "Now we are the last survivors of a murdered family, hiding in exile while a usurper sits on our parents' throne." The workshop fell silent, except for the humming of machinery. Ben looked at these two creatures he had raised from helpless babies, trying to reconcile the dragons he knew with the formal titles they had just claimed. "The markings on your scales," he said slowly. "Those aren't decorations. They're royal symbols, birthmarks of the royal bloodline," Cassius confirmed. "Every member of our family carries them. They become more pronounced as we reach maturity. We cannot hide what we are much longer." Ben sat down heavily on his work stool. 3 years. You've been here 3 years and you never told me." "We were children when you found us," Aurelia said, her voice gentling. "We barely remembered our own names, let alone our titles. The memories returned slowly as we grew. By the time we fully understood who we were terrified of losing the only family we had left." "Family?" Ben looked up at them. "You fed us when we were starving," Cassius said. "You gave us shelter when we had nowhere to go. You protected us and cared for us and never asked for anything in return. You are our father in every way that matters." Ben felt something tight in his chest loosen. "And you thought I would care that you're royalty?" "We thought you might feel obligated to send us away," Aurelia admitted. "To turn us over to authorities or try to contact our people. We thought you might treat us differently." Ben stood up and walked over to them, reaching out to rest his hands on their massive heads the way he had when they were small. "You're still my kids. Royal or not, you're still my family." Both dragons made happy sounds and pressed closer to him, suddenly seeming young again despite their impressive size. "But this changes things," Ben said practically. "If you're really the lost royalty that the news was talking about, then people are looking for you." "Dangerous people?" "Yes," Aurelia said solemnly. Empress Vex will never stop hunting us as long as we live. Our very existence threatens her claim to the throne. And it's not just her, Cassius added. There are bounty hunters, assassins, and rival noble houses who would benefit from capturing or killing us. Ben nodded slowly, his mind already working on the practical problems this revelation created. We need better security, better hiding places, and we need to be ready to run if we have to. You would do that for us? Aurelia asked. Leave your life here and run? Ben looked around his workshop, thinking about the comfortable life he had built over the past 3 years. Then he looked back at the 2 dragons who had made it all meaningful. This isn't my life, he said simply. You 2 are my life. Everything else is just stuff. Both dragons made sounds that were unmistakably crying, though their tears evaporated before they could fall. They pressed close to Ben, surrounding him with warmth and the comforting presence he had come to love more than anything else in the universe. We will find a way to keep you safe, Aurelia promised. Somehow, Ben smiled and patted her massive snout. We'll figure it out together. That's what families do. As the station's night cycle deepened around them, Ben began making mental lists of everything they would need to do, better defenses for the workshop, escape routes from the station, new identities and documentation, a dozen other preparations for the danger that was surely coming. But for now, he simply stood with his family and held them close, grateful for every moment they had together. The stranger walked into Ben's workshop on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. He looked human enough, wearing the standard coveralls of a cargo hauler, but something about him set Ben's nerves on edge. Maybe it was how his eyes moved, cataloging every corner of the workshop with the systematic attention of someone conducting surveillance. Maybe it was the way he asked too many questions about Ben's background and how long he had been on Series 7. Just need a simple power coupling repair, the man said, but his gaze kept drifting to the hidden passages Ben had built for Aurelia and Cassius. Heard you're the best mechanic in the belt. Ben worked on the repair while keeping the conversation minimal. Through their hidden monitoring system, he knew both dragons were watching from their concealed positions. They had developed hand signals over the past year that allowed them to communicate silently during potentially dangerous situations. When the stranger left, his power coupling perfectly repaired, Ben waited a full hour before speaking aloud. He wasn't here for repairs, Aurelia said, emerging from her hiding place. Her massive form moved with surprising stealth through the workshop she knew better than any maze. Bounty hunter, Cassius agreed, dropping down from the ceiling access panel where he had been listening. His questions were too specific, and he had weapons under his coveralls. Ben nodded grimly. They had been expecting this for 18 months, ever since learning the dragon's true identities. The surprise was that it had taken the hunters this long to trace them to Series 7. We need to accelerate the security upgrades, Ben said, pulling up the plans they had been working on for months. Over the following weeks, Ben's workshop transformed into something that would have made military engineers proud. He installed sensor arrays that could detect approaching ships before station traffic control spotted them. Hidden weapon systems emerged from concealed panels at the touch of a button. Emergency supply caches were scattered throughout the lower levels of the station. Most importantly, Ben had spent nearly every credit he earned over the past year purchasing favors and loyalties throughout Series 7. The mining families who depended on his repairs had become his extended network of eyes and ears. Cargo haulers who appreciated his quick service now carried messages and supplies to other stations, where Ben was building safe houses. The transformation hadn't been limited to security measures. Aurelia and Cassius had grown into their full adult size and power. But more than that, they had absorbed human approaches to problem-solving that no traditional dragon education would have. Included, Aurelia could now generate flames, precise enough to weld molecular bonds or hot enough to cut through battleship armor. But she had also learned human concepts of engineering and efficiency. She could analyze a broken machine and design improvements that combined dragon fireworking with human mechanical principles. Cassius had developed his electrical abilities until he could interface with any computer system in the galaxy, but he applied human concepts of information warfare and digital security. He could hack Imperial databases or create false identities that would fool even sophisticated verification systems. Together, they had begun teaching Ben techniques that no human had ever learned. how to sense the structural integrity of metal through touch, how to detect electrical problems by smell, how to repair machines using methods that combine the best of both species' approaches. "You're thinking like dragons now," Aurelia told Ben one evening as they worked together on a particularly complex reactor design. Seeing the patterns instead of just the parts, Ben had to admit she was right. 3.5 years of living with dragons had changed how he approached problems. He thought in terms of flow and harmony rather than simple mechanical function. His repair work had become more like art than mere technical skill, but their improved abilities would be tested sooner than any of them expected. The attack came during the station's night cycle, when most of the population was asleep. Ben's sensors detected the approaching ships while they were still hours away, but their configuration was unmistakably military. 3 vessels moving in formation, too large and too well-armed to be simple bounty hunters. "Imperial scouts," Cassius said, his claws interfacing directly with the station's communication systems to intercept their transmissions. "They're not trying to hide their approach. They think we don't know they're coming." Ben was already activating the emergency protocols they had rehearsed dozens of times. Blast shields sealed the workshop's windows. Hidden weapons powered up. Emergency beacons sent coded signals to their allies throughout the station and the asteroid belt. "They're demanding permission to search the station," Aurelia reported, monitoring official channels. "Station administration is trying to stall, but they don't have the authority to refuse an Imperial request." Within hours, Series 7 was crawling with dragon soldiers wearing the black armor of Empress Vex's personal forces. They moved through the station systematically, using detection equipment that could identify dragon pheromones and energy signatures. Ben watched their progress through his security cameras, noting how they searched. Professional and thorough, but they were looking for dragons hiding like dragons would hide. They checked high places and areas with good ventilation for flight. They scanned for the energy signatures of traditional dragon abilities. They didn't expect to find royalty hiding in a human mechanics workshop, concealed behind human engineering and protected by human-designed sensor dampeners. "They're 3 levels up and moving toward us," Ben reported. "Time to find out if our modifications work." Aurelia and Cassius disappeared into hiding places that would have been impossible for traditional dragons to use. Spaces too small for normal dragon claustrophobia, concealed behind human-designed false walls and electronic countermeasures. When the Imperial soldiers reached Ben's workshop, they found exactly what they expected to see: a human mechanic working late on a standard repair job, surrounded by the normal clutter of his trade. Their dragon senses detected nothing unusual beyond the expected mixture of metals and lubricants. "Identification," the squad leader demanded. Ben provided his standard documentation, carefully prepared and backstopped by Cassius's hacking skills. Work permits, station residency records, customer testimonials, all of it perfectly mundane and boring. The soldiers searched the workshop thoroughly, their equipment scanning for any trace of dragon presence. But Ben's countermeasures, designed by someone who had lived with dragons for years and understood exactly what the detection systems would be looking for, provided complete concealment. "Clean," the squad leader finally announced. "Move to the next sector." After they left, Ben waited another hour before giving the all-clear signal. Aurelia and Cassius emerged from hiding, both visibly shaken by how close the Imperial forces had come. "They'll be back," Aurelia said. "This was just the first search. They'll expand the perimeter and try again with better equipment." "Let them come," Ben said firmly. "This is our home. We're not running unless we have no choice." But even as he spoke, Ben was already planning the next phase of their defenses. The Imperials had shown their hand now. He knew what they were capable of and how they operated. More importantly, he had something they didn't expect. 3.5 years of human ingenuity applied to the problem of protecting dragons had created capabilities that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. Aurelia and Cassius weren't just hidden royalty anymore. They were dragons who thought like humans and humans who moved like dragons. The hunt was intensifying, but Ben had faith in his family's ability to meet any challenge together. After all, they had been preparing for this moment since the day he first fed 2 hungry babies in a garbage disposal area. Now it was time to find out if a mechanic's love for his family could stand against the power of an empire. The massive dreadnought appeared at the edge of Series 7's sensor range without warning, dropping out of hyperspace like a dark moon materializing from nothing. Ben's modified detection systems picked it up immediately, but the ship's size made his blood run cold. This wasn't another scouting mission or bounty hunter expedition. This was the real thing. Dragon Imperial dreadnought domination, Cassius reported, his voice tight with fear as he accessed the ship's identification codes. Flagship of the Empress's personal guard. There are 3,000 soldiers aboard that thing. Ben stared at the tactical display showing the enormous vessel. It was larger than the entire mining station, bristling with weapons that could reduce Series 7 to scrap metal in minutes. This was the kind of ship that conquered planets, not searched for hidden refugees. Why would she send something that big? Ben asked. Because she's not just hunting us anymore, Aurelia said grimly. She's making a statement. Total overwhelming force to show the galaxy what happens to anyone who harbors enemies of the Empire. Within hours, the dreadnought had established a complete blockade around Series 7. No ships could approach or leave without Imperial permission. Smaller patrol craft swarmed through the asteroid belt, creating a net that would catch anyone trying to escape. The station's administrator received a formal communication from the ship's commander, and Ben listened to the recording through Cassius's tap into the station's systems. Attention Series 7 administration. This is General Titus of the Imperial Guard. We have confirmed intelligence that enemies of the Empire are hiding on your station. You will cooperate fully with our search and extraction operations. Any resistance will be considered an act of war against the Draconic Empire. Ben felt his stomach drop. This General Titus wasn't making requests or offering rewards. He was making demands backed by enough firepower to destroy everything Ben had ever cared about. But as the hours passed, and Imperial troops began landing on the station, Ben realized that something unexpected was happening. The miners and cargo haulers he had built relationships with over the years weren't cooperating with the Imperial forces. Instead, they were actively hindering the search. Power coupling failure in Sector 7, came a report over the station's communication system. Imperial troops trapped until repairs are complete. Environmental systems malfunction in Sector 12. Area evacuated pending maintenance. Computer glitch has locked down all personnel records. Technical staff working to resolve the issue. Ben smiled despite the danger. The human population of Series 7 was protecting him and his family, not because they knew about Aurelia and Cassius, but because they had come to see Ben as one of their own. The Imperial troops might have overwhelming force, but they were operating in hostile territory where every door lock, every computer system, and every piece of equipment seemed to develop mysterious problems whenever they tried to use it. They're stalling for us, Aurelia observed. Your people are buying us time. Our people, Ben corrected. This is our home now, but even human solidarity had limits. By the third day, Imperial forces had worked their way through most of the station's upper levels and were approaching the commercial district where Ben's workshop was located. Their equipment had been upgraded with military-grade sensors that could penetrate most concealment systems. Ben gathered his family in the workshop's main area for what might be their last conversation as free beings. I have a confession to make, he told Aurelia and Cassius. For the past 2 years, I've been building something I hoped we'd never need to use. He led them to a sealed chamber he had constructed behind his main storage area. Inside was something that looked like a suit of armor designed for someone twice Ben's size. But it wasn't just armor. It was a complete life support and weapon system that incorporated every technique he had learned from living with dragons. Human engineering powered by dragon abilities, Ben explained. Fire channeling systems designed around Aurelia's flame control. Electrical interfaces built for Cassius's power manipulation, and weapons systems that combine both approaches. The armor was beautiful in its own way, crafted from materials Ben had acquired over years of careful trading. Heat-resistant alloys that could withstand dragon fire, conductive pathways that could channel electrical attacks, and at its heart a power source that required dragon abilities to activate. You built this for us? Cassius asked. I built it for all of us, Ben said. It's designed so we can work together even when facing impossible odds. Before they could discuss the implications further, alarms began sounding throughout the station. Imperial forces had reached their sector and were demanding access to all workshops and businesses. This is it, Aurelia said. Time to make our choice. Ben was already moving toward the armor, but Cassius stopped him with a gentle claw on his shoulder. Wait, the young dragon said. Before we do this, we need to tell you something else. Now? Ben asked. Especially now, Aurelia said. We've been talking and we've made a decision about our future. About what we want to do if we survive this. Ben paused in his preparations. What kind of decision? We don't want revenge, Cassius said simply. We don't want to reclaim our throne through violence or start another war that will kill thousands of innocent dragons. We want to do something different, Aurelia continued. Something we learned from humans. We want to show our people a better way to live. Ben stared at them. You want to go back to the Empire? Eventually, Aurelia said. But not as conquering royalty. As teachers, we want to introduce concepts like democracy, cooperation, and individual rights. We want to build a government that serves its people instead of ruling them through fear. And we want you to help us, Cassius added, as our advisor and our family. Before Ben could respond, the workshop's main door exploded inward. Imperial troops poured through the opening, weapons raised and scanning for targets. Behind them came a figure in elaborate armor that marked her as high nobility. General Titus, Aurelia said formally, stepping into view with Cassius beside her. The Imperial soldiers stopped, stunned by the sight of the two massive dragons they had been hunting for years. But their surprise lasted only moments before training took over, and weapons were aimed at the dragons' vital points. Princess Aurelia and Prince Cassius, General Titus said with cold satisfaction, by order of Empress Vex, you are under arrest for treason against the Imperial crown. We are not subjects of your Empress, Aurelia replied calmly. We recognize no authority but our own birthright. Your birthright died with your parents, General Titus snarled. The Empire has moved beyond the old ways. Empress Vex has brought order and strength to our people. Through murder and fear, Cassius said. That's not strength. That's desperation. General Titus gestured to her troops. Take them. Kill the human if he interferes. That was when Ben activated the armor. Power flowed through systems he had spent years perfecting, channeling abilities that no human was supposed to possess. Dragon fire erupted from the suit's weapon ports, controlled with human precision and mechanical reliability. Electrical systems crackled to life, turning the workshop into a storm of controlled lightning. The Imperial troops found themselves facing something they had never encountered before. A human who fought like a dragon, protected by armor that turned their weapons aside and powered by abilities that should have been impossible. But Ben wasn't fighting alone. Aurelia and Cassius moved with him in perfect coordination, their natural abilities enhanced by human tactical thinking and mechanical precision. They had become something new, something that combined the best aspects of both species. What are you? General Titus demanded, staring at Ben in his dragon-powered armor. I'm a mechanic, Ben replied simply. And these are my kids, and nobody threatens my family. The battle that followed would be remembered in both human and dragon histories as the moment when two species truly became one. The battle in Ben's workshop lasted exactly 17 minutes, but those 17 minutes changed the course of galactic history. When the smoke cleared and the emergency lights stopped flashing, General Titus lay unconscious among her scattered troops, and Ben stood in his dragon-powered armor surrounded by the two beings who had become the most important thing in his universe. Is it over? Cassius asked, carefully checking to make sure none of the Imperial soldiers were seriously injured. This part is, Aurelia said, but her attention was focused on the communication equipment the troops had brought with them. But now comes the hard part. She was right. Within hours, news of the failed capture spread throughout the Draconic Empire. The lost royalty had not only survived, but had somehow gained abilities and allies that made them more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Empress Vex's response was swift and predictable. She declared total war on Series 7 and prepared to send a fleet that would reduce the entire asteroid belt to space dust. But Aurelia and Cassius had learned more from their years with humans than just new ways to fight. They had learned new ways to think about power and leadership. We're not going to run, Aurelia announced to the assembled population of Series 7. And we're not going to hide anymore. It's time to show the Empire what we've learned. Using the Imperial communication equipment, they broadcast a message across every dragon-controlled system in the galaxy. Not a declaration of war or a demand for submission, but something that had never been heard before in the Empire's long history. My fellow dragons, Aurelia began, speaking directly to billions of beings who had lived their entire lives under authoritarian rule. I am Princess Aurelia, rightful heir to the Imperial throne, and I come to you not as a conqueror, but as someone who has learned a better way to live. The message that followed was unlike anything in dragon political tradition. Instead of claiming divine authority or superior bloodline, Aurelia talked about democracy and individual rights. She spoke of governments that served their people rather than ruling them. She described concepts like freedom of speech, representative government, and peaceful transfers of power. "I have learned these ideas from humans," she said, and the camera panned to show Ben standing beside her, still wearing his dragon-powered armor. "This is Ben Carter, who saved my life and my brother's life when we were helpless refugees. He has become our father and our teacher, showing us that strength comes not from dominating others but from protecting those who cannot protect themselves." Cassius joined the broadcast, adding his own perspective on the human concepts of justice and equality that had shaped their thinking over the years. "We challenge Empress Vex not to single combat for the throne, but to a contest of ideas," he announced. "Let the dragon people choose for themselves what kind of government they want. Let them decide whether they prefer to live in fear or in freedom." The response was immediate and explosive. Across the Empire, dragons who had lived under oppression for generations began organizing protests and demanding political reforms. Vex's military forces found themselves torn between loyalty to their commanders and sympathy for populations that were finally speaking out against authoritarian rule. But Vex herself was not interested in political debates or peaceful transitions. Her response came in the form of a fleet of warships heading directly for Series 7, intent on destroying the source of rebellion before it could spread further. "She's bringing everything," Cassius reported, monitoring Imperial communications. 50 warships, including 3 more dreadnoughts. "She means to make an example of us." Ben looked at the tactical displays showing the approaching fleet and felt a familiar calmness settle over him. It was the same feeling he got when facing a particularly challenging repair job. Just another problem to solve, albeit one with higher stakes than usual. "Then, we'll have to teach her the same lesson we taught her, General," he said. The battle for Series 7 lasted 3 days and became known throughout the galaxy as the day that changed everything. Ben's combination of human engineering and dragon abilities had inspired similar innovations throughout the asteroid belt. Human miners and cargo haulers fought alongside dragons who had escaped from Imperial service, creating fighting forces that operated with unprecedented coordination and effectiveness. But the real victory came not through superior firepower, but through superior ideas. As the battle raged, more and more of Vex's own forces began switching sides, convinced by the broadcasts that continued streaming from Series 7. Dragons, who had never imagined alternatives to Imperial rule, suddenly saw possibilities for lives, free from constant surveillance and control. When Empress Vex finally arrived, aboard her personal flagship, she found not a simple rebellion to crush, but a revolution of ideas that had already infected her own forces. Her demands for surrender were met with counteroffers of negotiation and peaceful resolution. The climactic confrontation took place not in space but in the conference chamber hastily constructed in Ben's expanded workshop. Vex, accompanied by her remaining loyal guards, faced Aurelia and Cassius across a table where Ben sat as mediator and advisor. "You have cost me an empire," Vex said coldly. "I should have killed you as babies." "You never had an empire," Aurelia replied. "You had a prison with yourself as the warden. We're offering something better." The negotiations that followed were unlike anything in dragon history. Instead of the traditional challenge system where disputes were settled through combat, they used human diplomatic techniques. Compromise, mediation, and the search for solutions that addressed everyone's legitimate concerns. In the end, Vex agreed to step down in exchange for amnesty and a role in the transitional government that would guide the Empire toward democratic rule. It wasn't the crushing victory that traditional dragon politics would have demanded, but it was something more valuable. It was a solution that stopped the killing and gave everyone a chance to build something better. The new government that emerged from those negotiations was a hybrid of dragon tradition and human innovation. Aurelia became the elected leader rather than the hereditary ruler, with Cassius serving as her chief advisor. But the real innovation was Ben's role as ambassador of cross-species cooperation, tasked with teaching other species the lessons that humans and dragons had learned together. 5 years after Ben first found 2 starving babies in a garbage disposal area, he stood in the embassy that had been built around his original workshop. The space was now filled with beings from dozens of species, all working together on problems that no single race could solve alone. Aurelia and Cassius still visited him every day, though their responsibilities as leaders of the reformed empire kept them busy traveling throughout the galaxy. They were no longer the helpless refugees he had rescued, but they were still his family in every way that mattered. "Any regrets?" Cassius asked one evening as they sat together in the workshop that had become the center of a new kind of civilization. Ben looked around at the space where he had spent the happiest years of his life, surrounded by the evidence of what could happen when different species chose cooperation over conflict. "Just one," he said with a smile. "I wish I'd made that first sandwich bigger." "You two were really hungry." Both dragons laughed, the sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, and Ben knew that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could indeed change the galaxy. The mechanics' workshop had become an embassy. The refugee children had become democratic leaders, and the grease-stained human who had shared his lunch with two strangers had become proof that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't military might or ancient magic, but simple compassion applied at exactly the right moment. Outside the workshop windows, the stars shone down on a galaxy that was learning, one species at a time, that there were better ways to live than the old systems of fear and domination. And in a small workshop that smelled of oil and metal and home, a family that had chosen each other continued to work together, fixing the things that were broken and building something better for everyone.